Hi, everyone. This is Nancy Helt, and
I'm Nancy Kruber.
We are San Diego Master Gardeners. Thank you for inviting us to speak today. This subject of soil has been a passion of ours for a long time, and it gives us great pleasure to share what we have learned with you today. Soil is truly the heart and soul of the garden, and a healthy soil is alive. If we have healthy soils, we have healthy plants, healthy animals, and healthy people. We hope by the end of this talk that you will have a new view of the world beneath your feet. Here is the outline of what we're going to cover today. A bit of vocabulary, what is soil compared to dirt, and what are characteristics of healthy soil. Nancy K. will guide you through the soil matrix and the billions of microbes that work together to make soil healthy. Then I will be back to talk about several ways you can keep your soil healthy. The first word is rhizosphere, the area around the roots of the plant where the microbes, soil, and plant roots interact. Organic matter, anything that is or was once alive. Soil food web, also known as the SFW, all the organisms in the soil and how they interact to keep things in balance. Microbes, microscopic organisms. Microbes naturally occur in the environment, we just can't see them. We have several names for the massive microbes. We call them the microbiome, or a fun name is to call them the microherd. And Nancy Kruber will introduce you to them in her talk. Exudates, the sugars, proteins, and carbohydrates that come out of all parts of the plant and are a product of photosynthesis. Plants put exudates into the root zone to attract the helpful microbes. Dr. Elaine Ingham, one of the top soil scientists in the US, describes exudates as the cakes and cookies plants use to bring the needed microbes into its rhizosphere. And you see, plants are very clever. So what is in soil? What do you already know about what is in soil? What have you heard or read about healthy soils? Keep those thoughts in mind as we go through this presentation. Soils can vary greatly, but healthy soils generally have these characteristics. Healthy soil has a clean, earthy, pleasant smell and is usually dark brown in color. Healthy soil attracts lots of wildlife, those you can see, and a lot of wildlife you cannot. Healthy soil holds moisture, yet it drains well. And healthy soil allows roots to grow deeply.
So this is a diagram of an idealized soil. Notice that there are 45% mineral particles, which are your sands, silts, and clays, or things that originally came from parent rock. So the minerals, just think of them as really teeny tiny rocks. 25% air, 25% water, which is rather remarkable when you think that half of your soil should really be about half air and water. And we'll talk about how those spaces are made available in a good, healthy soil. And then here we have 5% organic matter. Now, that's why this diagram is an idealized soil. Lots of us only have maybe 1 or 2%. If you could have 3% or more, that would be great. 5% would be amazing. So keep those plant roots in and add organic matter, such as compost or mulch, and you may get your soils that way. But the next part that we're going to talk about is really focusing on the mineral particles, just the parts that were formed from rocks. So let's talk about that. All right, when we talk about soil texture, we are talking about the proportion of sand, silt, and clay in your soil. And something that you really need to keep in mind is that soil texture cannot be changed. It's just what you have, but it's really good to know what you have. Now, what is sand, silt, and clay? It has to do with the size of the particle. So if you look at this diagram down here, you look at this big yellow circle, and this represents sand particles because they're really rather large. This tiny red dot here represents clay particles because they're the smallest ones. And the blue represents the silt, which is sort of a medium-sized particle. If you take your soil and put it in your hand and rub it, if you feel something that feels gritty, you're feeling the sandy part of your soil. If you're feeling something that's really slippery, you're feeling the silt in your soil. And if you feel something that feels a little tacky or sticky, you're feeling the clay. And just to go over a little bit of something about each of these, clay, because it's so tiny, will also create teeny tiny pore spaces, but a lot of them. Sand, though, will have because it has such large particles, has very large pore spaces. Think about how easily water goes through sand with all those big particles. And then silt, of course, is always in between the two of them. And with sand, you also get less nutrient holding capacity. Clay, you get a lot. There's a lot of nutrients that will hold on to clay, whereas very little will stay on into sand. And just so you know, we'll talk about this in a minute too, most of our soils will have a combination of sand, silt, and clay. And so then you will have what is called a loam. You know, occasionally you might have just one kind, especially if you're on the beach, perhaps. So there are some tests you can do at home to determine what kind of texture. And we talked about nutrients. We talked about how your texture can determine how well the water goes through. Again, if sandy soil, it's going to go through quickly. In clay soil, your water will go through very slowly. And some combination, it actually might hold on to that water pretty well, but that's more in the area of structure, and we will get to structure in a minute. So back to soil texture. There are two at-home tests that you can easily do. This one is called the jar test or the sedimentation test. And for this test, what you do is you get a jar, you put your soil in it. Now, when you gather your soil from your garden, you want to push away that organic layer. You don't want any of the leaves or any kind of mulch you have, because you're really trying to just figure out the mineral particle. You're going to fill your jar about halfway with that, add some water and leave a little headspace, screw the cap on tightly, and you're going to shake it up till it's really, really, really mixed well. You're going to put that down, and then you're going to let the particles settle out. Sand is the heaviest. It will go first. Then you will have your silts, and then lastly your clays. And sometimes if the clay is really fine, it won't ever come out of solution and settle down. But after 24 to 48 hours, you can go ahead and take a ruler, measure how tall all the minerals are. I like to do it in centimeters, but you can do it in inches too. And then decide how many how wide each of the individual layers are. And from that, you can figure out a percentage. And then if you look online, there will be soil texture triangles where you can figure out, knowing how much silt, sand, and clay you have, you can figure out what kind of soil. And some of the names are silty clay loam or clay loam or sandy clay loam or sandy loam. Loam again is, or not again, I don't think I've mentioned it yet. Loam is the combination of sand, silts, and clays. And if you have more sand in that combination, that's when it would be called a sandy loam. If you had more clay, it's going to be called a clay loam, and more silt, it's a silty loam. So you can kind of get those words. Another test you can do, and again, you can look this up on the internet. They do have, there are YouTube videos and or just graphics like you see on the right here, where they can help you to do a soil ribbon test. But in the ribbon test, what you're doing is you're taking some soil, you're putting it in your hand, you're getting it wet, maybe with a spray bottle. You're going to make sure you can make a nice ball with your soil. And after that, you're going to try to make a ribbon by, pushing your thumb against the soil until it makes a ribbon, and then you see how big a piece of ribbon it is when it actually falls off. Once you kind of make that ribbon and it's coming out here, eventually it will fall down, and then you can measure how long that is and then use one of these charts to decide what kind of soil you have. In this example here, I'm guessing there's a lot of clay in here because clay does not break easily and sand does. So if you do it and you've got like a 1/4 of an inch and it drops, then you know you've got a lot of sand in that soil. Okay, now we're going to move on to soil structure. And soil structure happens when you have your minerals and you combine them with organic matter and, of course, air and water. Soil structure has to do with something called aggregates. And here is a diagram of an aggregate that includes living things such as roots and microbes, but it also has your minerals. So aggregates are the smaller and larger clumps that are found in soil and compost. When you have aggregates, you create pore spaces for water, air, and root penetration, as well as hiding places for microbes. Aggregates are organic matter and minerals held together by glues produced by microbes, minerals, and exudates from the roots. And exudates are just the sugars and carbohydrates, maybe proteins, that come out of the roots and feed the microbial population. Soil structure is something you can change by adding organic matter, as opposed to the texture, which, remember, you just have what you have, but structure you can affect in your garden. So what are the benefits of soil organic matter and therefore soil structure? Well, soil organic matter helps in the formation of soil aggregates. The organic matter contributes to water holding capacity. When you have good soil structure, your water is allowed to drain well through your soil rather than running off. When you add soil organic matter and create that structure, your roots now can go deep into the ground where they want to go. They aren't stopped by a compaction layer where they have to go off to the side. Organic matter provides a source of nutrients for the food web, and it also provides a slow release nutrient source for your plants. Now, coming back to this soil matrix again, we explored mineral particles. We've talked a little bit about the air and water, or at least the spaces where those can live. And we have talked a little bit about the benefits of organic matter, but now we're going to go more into organic matter, particularly talking about the organisms, but also about the roots. So we're going to soon learn about all the organisms in the soil food web, but I first want to have you think about this. It all starts with plants because plants are really in control of what happens in the soil. So when you have a plant with its green leaves, it takes energy from the sun and carbon dioxide from the air, and it takes it in, and within that plant body, all of those things are converted into sugars, which the plant can use for energy, but it also uses as what we're saying as exudates. The exudates come out the leaves, the stems, the roots, but since we're talking about soil today, we're really going to focus on what's happening in the roots. And when the plants put out those exudates, they put different kinds at different times in its growth cycle so that it will attract the different microbial community to it, which helps it feed itself. And we're going to go into a little bit about how that happens in a minute. When plants are producing those exudates, though, this is what it should look like underground. You should have all of this soil clinging to the roots. If you have this, what it's telling you is that the roots or the plant is functioning properly. Exudates are being put out, which is attracting the microbes and the organic matter to stay glued around the root system. And by having this, what's called a rhizosheath around the roots, this root is not only getting fed, or this plant is getting fed through its roots, but it's also getting some protection from pests and disease, because these are good guys around here, and it really helps prevent the more pathogenic organisms from getting in. So now we're going to start on bacteria and fungi. And a lot of people, when they hear the words bacteria or fungus, they go, oh no, that those are all bad and they're going to kill my plants. And what I want to bring to you today is, yeah, sure, you're right. There are some pathogenic bacteria and pathogenic fungi which can produce disease. But what we want to talk about today is all the beneficial bacteria and the beneficial fungi that can actually help your plants. Now, there are a lot more beneficial than pathogenic. The other thing I would like to talk to you about before we get looking at pictures is that bacteria and fungi are the true decomposers in the soil. We have animals, and we'll see them that kind of shred and tear things apart and eat things. But bacteria actually bring those, or the organic matter in the dead bodies of plants and animals. And they, when they're in their body, they're in a form that can be nutrients for plants, but they hold them in their body. But everything is turned into sort of the basics. And they hold on to those nutrients until they're eaten by predators. And we're going to go and see what happens with that in a minute. But it's really important to know that when you have bacteria and fungi in the soil that are decomposing, that they hold the nutrients for the plants. They aren't washed away and leached. Like if you put chemical fertilizers in, and often we put too much, and then plants take up a little bit, but the rest goes through. They're really held tight. So bacteria can come in many forms, but there are a couple basic shapes. One is the bacillus, or the rod shapes, and the other is cocci with these teeny tiny little dots. Here, cocci just means round. Sometimes you've got bigger and smaller. So that's just something that I want you to see, that this is what it looks like under a microscope. And remember that they're holding all those nutrients, but they also produce a glue, a sticky little glue that helps to start forming micro aggregates. So the bacteria will pull together the mineral particles and the organic matter into tiny little clumps with a micro aggregate. So it's like building the bricks to make bigger aggregates. And here's some picture of fungi. On the left here, we have fungal hyphae. This is under a microscope at 400 times total magnification. And you can see how kind of stringy it looks when they're microscopic in the soil. This is a picture of mushrooms, which is the fruiting body of fungi. And over here, some little mycelium. It was from my yard in Northern California, where in the fall, I just looked in the organic matter, and I often have a lot of this fungi in there, and it's all decomposing. So remember when the bacteria help form the micro aggregates, those little tiny ones? Well, the fungi can come along, and with their filamentous bodies, there's this hypha and this mycelium, they can take those micro aggregates and sort of tie them together and glue them as well. They also produce glues to make bigger macro aggregates. And remember, when you have the larger and smaller aggregates in your soil, they form air pockets or pore spaces where air and water and roots can penetrate. So it's important to have this kind of structure in your soil. Now, there's two kinds of fungi. There's saprophytic fungi, which decompose organic matter, and that's their main job, is to decompose dead things. Can you imagine if bodies of plants and animals just kind of stayed there on the ground? We'd have kind of a mess. So we need things to decompose, and the bacteria and fungi will do that, and it's the saprophytic fungi which do that. There's another type of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi, which partner with plants in a mutualistic relationship. So what happens there is the plants will feed the fungi sugars, And in return, the fungi will go out and get nutrients and water that the plant needs. So they're kind of feeding each other. They communicate and they feed each other. This is a picture of mycorrhizal fungi partnering with roots. You can see this yellow, thicker parts are the roots, and this more cloudy area are the mycorrhizal fungi. So you can see how the area where the plant can get food is greatly extended when they're allowed to partner with these mycorrhizal fungi. All right, now we're moving on to predators. So when predators come along and they eat the bacteria and the fungi, or other animals that are just smaller than they are, they use the nutrients from the bodies of these organisms, and whatever is in excess, they excrete out into the soil. And what they excrete out of the soil then is available to plants. It's in the right form that the plants can simply take up. So let's meet the predators. So the first one are protozoa. And over here you can see testate amoeba. These are amoeba that live in little shells or tests. It's kind of like a snail, right? They have their own little homes. This is a cercozoa, and this is a naked amoeba. So these are 3 different types that you might see. There are others as well. This is a flagellate, and I know you really can't see it well in there, but this arrow is pointing to this guy has a little tail called a flagellum, and that's how it moves around. It kind of bumbles through the soil solution. And then over here we have in red something called a ciliate. It's a pretty large protozoa, but it has all these little hairs on it called cilia, and that's how it moves around and how it gathers its food. Mostly these guys eat bacteria. The reason that this is boxed in red is because when you find these, you find them in more low oxygen conditions, which is fine. Sometimes when you have earthworms, there are little pockets of anaerobic with less air, and you're going to find these. But most of the time, your healthy soil is going to contain these types of protozoa, and that indicates aerobic conditions in your soil. And again, when these guys eat their bacteria and they poop out their excess nutrients, it is now available to plants. Now, these are nematodes. And again, people tend to hear nematodes or nematodes, however you want to pronounce it. I pronounce it nematodes. They're concerned about this guy in the red box, which is a root-feeding nematode. And yes, if you see one of these, you don't want it around your plants. It will do damage. You can see that this root feeder has a spear and this big knob at the end to help push its spear into a root and feed from your root. And you don't want these. But again, it's only a small portion of what should be in your soil. Most of them are going to be good guys, such as this bacterial feeder, which just goes around eating bacteria, and this fungal feeder, which goes around eating fungi. There also are predatory nematodes that will eat other nematodes, but their favorite are root feeders. So there are a lot more kinds of good guys, and if they're there, again, they're going to be protecting your plants and keeping those root feeders away, and the root feeders are going to go someplace where the food source is more easy to get to. Then we have microarthropods and macroarthropods, and I just want you to look at the size of the photo. They're not taken at the same magnification. This guy over here on the right is a springtail or a columbella, and it is quite blown up. If you see it with your naked eye, it's just a little tiny white speck. Usually you see them in compost and a lot of times in vermicompost, and if you put your finger next to those little specks, they kind of jump around. They're kind of fun, and they like to eat fungi. And over here should be some common macroarthropods. You can see them with your eyes of a millipede and a centipede. But all these guys, they'll eat other things, again, poop out nutrients that are good for your plants. They also are little taxi cabs for the little microbes. The little microbes can live on them, and they can spread them through the soil, and they can make tunnels. And next is another guy that can do the same thing. Of course, the earthworm, who makes tunnels, can be a taxi cab. They're nourished by the bacteria and fungi they eat. Both the microarthropods and the earthworms do something called comminute. They comminute or break apart plant material. Then there's all this extra surface area for bacteria and fungi to break down those organic matters further. So everything's really working together in the soil. So now we're going to put this all together. This is a diagram of the soil food web where it all starts with the sun. The sun shines down on the plants have the exudates, and there are bacteria and fungi and all the critters who eat. And so we're going to just review that here. So most of the action in the soil is happening around the rhizosphere or around the roots. You need a diversity of organisms for all this nutrient cycling to happen. All of the plants dying, the bacteria and fungi decomposing, and many different critters being able to eat and then poop and produce those nutrients to go through the whole system. When you have all this in place, it sets the stage for optimal plant growth. It will protect your plants from pests and disease when they are healthy. Remember, pests and disease want to come after plants that are not as healthy. So your plants will be much better off if your soil life is good. And healthy soil has the ability to detoxify pollutants. And that's a really important thing too. Okay, now I'm going to give this presentation back to Nancy Helt to talk to you about the practical ways that you can keep your soil healthy.
Thanks, Nancy. We've learned a bit about the many creatures that inhabit our soil, as well as how they interact with each other and the soil structure. In the next slides, we'll cover some simple ways that you can care for your soil now that you know who lives there. Before we start, it's important to remember to look at nature for the answers to our gardening questions. In other words, you think like a forest. Ask yourself, how does nature do this? Let's look at some practical do's and don'ts so we can mimic nature and grow healthy soils.
All right, go ahead.
Okay. In a forest, there's always ground cover, either by a diversity of plants or by leaf fall. When you don't keep the ground covered, notice what can happen in the photo on the left. You can see a problem with compaction, the footprints, drainage, the standing water, and eventually you might have runoff and soil crusting too. Compaction from driving vehicles and walking on the earth can be a big problem. The weight on the soil crushes the air spaces and then prevents water from percolating down into the soil. With more rain, this puddling can then become runoff, which washes away our topsoil. Remember the soil test jar and what minerals floated to the top? Soil crusting happens when the water dries up and the clay has floated to the top, and the sun then bakes it. The clay forms a hard crust, preventing air and water exchange. By the way, did you know raindrops fall hard enough to compact the soil? So the best solution, stay on marked trails when hiking or biking, and in your garden, use a mulched walkway and stepping stones. Now let's talk about the photo on the right. Do you ever notice what plants come in first when you have bare ground? It's weeds. Weeds, of course, are actually nature's way of restoring the land. So if you can't keep your soil covered with plants, it's best to put on a layer of compost, then cover with mulch. And I'll be talking about this further in our next slide. Digging and rototilling breaks up the precious soil aggregates and fungal hyphae. And it causes all that beautiful structure and pore spaces that your microbes built to collapse. So please be gentle with your soil. When you make a new garden bed, dig in and compost about 6 to 8 inches, and that is the only time you need to dig. For mature beds, just add compost and then cover with leaves, straw, or wood chips as mulch on the surface of your beds. Well, let me make sure everybody understands the difference between compost and mulch. Compost is the fine-grained organic matter that is the result of microbes and the critters in the soil food web. Compost has all the nutrients and microbes your plants need for health and growth. Mulch is a chunky substance that gardeners use to cover the ground to protect the soil from sun, evaporation, compaction, and weeds. Depending on the type of garden you have, mulches can be a thick layer of straw, fallen leaves, ground up woody material, or even stones. We're now going to show you two very short videos by Ray Archuleta when he was with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And even though he's talking about soils in an agricultural system, it's no different than our backyard soils. We can learn a lot from the research on ag soils. Through these two films, you will see why limiting digging is so important.
I have a question to ask you. Is your soil healthy, functioning, and stable? One of the best visual diagnostic tools that I know of is the soil stability test. Here are two soils, exactly the same soil type. This soil has been tilled for 30 years. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It is covered with diverse plants year-round. Watch what happens when we drop the soil in the water. Notice how the conventional till soil is falling apart. The biotic glues in the organic matter are burned up by tillage. The soil pores have collapsed. Notice the no-till soil. The pore spaces are still intact. Do this test for yourself. I guarantee if you dig a little, you'll learn a lot. Show you how soil disturbance through tillage impacts soil function. Here are two soils. This soil has been disturbed by conventional tillage. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It's virtually undisturbed. Watch what happens when I simulate rainfall on these two soils. The undisturbed soil allows every precious inch to infiltrate. This is good for your production and for the environment. The disturbed soil does not allow the water to infiltrate. Most of the water is going to run off. Place your soil into drought mode and put your nutrients into the nearest lake. So when it comes to building healthy, productive soils, remember, do not disturb.
You'll recall from our slide, Characteristics of Healthy Soil, that healthy soil holds moisture yet also drains well. This video is a perfect example of that. So what is our solution to increase our soil's organic matter, water holding capacity, allow it to drain well, and also grow healthy plants? It's composting. Composting is one of the best things you can do for your soil and the environment. The 50% greens are your kitchen scraps from fruits and vegetables, coffee and tea, grass clippings, and green leaves. Browns are dried leaves and woody material. You can even shred your newspapers and junk mail to use as browns. It's very important to keep your compost pile slightly moist and add oxygen by turning your pile frequently. To learn more, there are master composter classes offered at locations around your county. Another way to keep your soil food web healthy is the no-till method that Ray Archuleta mentioned. This means leaving the roots of healthy plants in the ground by cutting off the plant at the surface. This adds organic matter to the soil as they decompose and the roots leave channels for water and air penetration. And really, think about what we've learned today. Roots are covered with microbes, so why pull them out?
This slide is about the sides: pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. There are many products on the market. There are products that will kill everything, the good and the bad, and there are products that are targeted, and some are more earth-friendly. There are so many products. So what is the best solution to an insect, weed, or suspected fungus problem? It is important to first use integrated pest management, or IPM for short. These strategies are tested, proven effective, and use the least toxic methods first. Sometimes one of the quickest non-toxic solutions might be just changing how you water, or maybe spraying a solution of just soap and water. Using IPM methods protects you, your family, pets, and the soil food web. The UC IPM website is listed at the end of our talk. Please bookmark it and let it be one of the first places you turn to for handling garden problems. There also can be some problems with using inorganic fertilizers. If overused, they can throw off the balance of our soil food web. You see, plants prefer nutrients in small quantities available all the time. When inorganics are overused, these big shots of nutrition are only partially absorbed by the plants, and the remainder of it can flow right through the groundwater or run off with irrigation and flooding and end up polluting our watershed, affecting our creeks, rivers, and our ocean ecosystems. So if you are using inorganic fertilizers, use the timed or slow release types and decrease the amounts. We also recommend that you nurture and grow the soil food web until you're ideally using mainly compost. This improves the soil structure and increases production of beneficial bacteria and fungi. What makes healthy soil is feeding the microbiome, which also feeds the plants, and it is the organic matter of compost that can do it.
And lastly, blowers. Oh my gosh, they blow off topsoil and mulch. The bare ground then becomes compacted and dries out quickly, which of course is detrimental to your soil life because of lack of water and air. So the solution is please use blowers only on hardscape.
Got me down.
You got it.
This slide is about the sides: pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. There are many products on the market. There are products that will kill everything, the good and the bad, and there are products that are targeted, and some are more earth-friendly. There are so many products. So what is the best solution to an insect, weed, or suspected fungus problem? It is important to first use integrated pest management, or IPM for short. These strategies are tested, proven effective, and use the least toxic methods first. Sometimes one of the quickest non-toxic solutions might be just changing how you water, or maybe spraying a solution of just soap and water. Using IPM methods protects you, your family, pets, and the soil food web. The UC IPM website is listed at the end of our talk. Please bookmark it and let it be one of the first places you turn to for handling garden problems. There also can be some problems with using inorganic fertilizers. If overused, they can throw off the balance of our soil food web. You see, plants prefer nutrients in small quantities available all the time. When inorganics are overused, these big shots of nutrition are only partially absorbed by the plants, and the remainder of it can flow right through the groundwater or run off with irrigation and flooding and end up polluting our watershed, affecting our creeks, rivers, and our ocean ecosystems. So if you are using inorganic fertilizers, use the timed or slow release types and decrease the amounts. We also recommend that you nurture and grow the soil food web until you're ideally using mainly compost. This improves the soil structure and increases production of beneficial bacteria and fungi. What makes healthy soil is feeding the microbiome, which also feeds the plants, and it is the organic matter of compost that can do it.
Now let's review the 4 major points of our presentation. Soil has texture, which you can't change, and structure that you can change. And how do you change structure? By adding organic material. Number 2, having good structure means that aggregates have had time to form, and they offer passageways where air, water, and roots can penetrate or infiltrate. Don't forget, the microherd needs passages for air and moisture and to move around. 3, plants are in control, and photosynthesis runs the whole system. Photosynthesis between the sun and the plants causes everything that happens in a plant's life. Plants are in control as they produce exudates, the microbe food, at the right time for their own growth and health. Number 4, all the nutrients that your plants need are available in your soil as long as the whole soil food web is present to cycle nutrients. Healthy soil has an organic component. Adding good compost feeds the microherd and therefore your plants. So keep your soil life happy and grow a healthy garden. Thank you to the San Diego Public Library. Nancy Kruber and I want to thank the library for offering the summer reading program and their wonderful contribution to our community, the Seed Library. Here, under website resources, we want to point out 2 of our references. The Integrated Pest Management website is the second listing, and the Solana Center to learn about composting is the last entry on this page. See the 2 arrows? Thank you all for tuning in today to hear about the importance of living soil.